Consciousness raising was actually a political technique used by the Revolutionary Army of Mao Zedong, and his slogan was, "Speak bitterness to recall bitterness, speak pain to recall pain." To promote discord and instability in a village, his political revolutionaries would call the townswomen together and get them to talk about their hurts. Come tell me about the hurts that you've experienced. So the women were encouraged to speak bitterness and pain, and the initial reluctance gave way to collective anger as woman after woman told stories of being raped by landlords, being sold as concubines, or physical abuse. And as women vented their bitterness, they experienced a newfound strength and resolve that empowered them to corporate action. For example, in one village, a peasant man was physically pummeled to a pulp and attacked by an entire group of women because he hadn't been treating his wife well. Together, the woman found the strength to act and to confront their situation and the resolve to be active in forcing change. And that is how Mao Zedong got his revolution. In the fall of 1968, feminist leader Kathy Sarahchild organized a guide and a manifesto to consciousness raising and presented it to the first Women's Liberation Conference held in Chicago 40 years ago. She proposed that the feminist movement use this political technique to activate a broad-scale gender revolution. She argued that through consciousness-raising groups, women's small sparks of discontentment that they felt in their spirit could be fanned into an inferno of corporate discontent and political action. The dynamics of the small group was the most powerful, effective tool to lead women to a personal aha moment of consciousness raising, the moment that she accepts and she understands that all the problems in the world and all the problems of women are due to the rule of men, and that she has the right to take things back into her own hands. Consciousness raising encouraged women to change their beliefs and behaviors, to make demands in their relationships, to support the women's movement, and to become politically active. These groups they just proliferated like wildfire throughout the 60s. Some of you will remember an old commercial for hair products that went, "And she told two friends, and she told two friends, and she told two friends." The commercial started with a picture of one woman and then added the pictures of the two women that she had told and then the women that they had told. And soon the screen is full of hundreds upon hundreds of pictures of women, and that's exactly how feminism spread. There were only about 200 women at the first National Women's Conference in Chicago in 1968, 40 years ago. But with the help of consciousness raising, women across the continent began to claim the right to name and define themselves, and by 1970, 20,000 women marched proudly down New York's Fifth Avenue, identifying themselves as part of the women's lib movement. Betty Friedan summed up the tenor of the movement when she blazed, "There is no way any man, woman, or child is ever going to escape the nature of our revolution." The shift in mindset, the feminist movement began to shift in mindset at this time. Women began to see themselves as a sex class and as a distinct class of people that needed liberation, that needed freedom, and that needed freedom from oppression. The first phase of the movement viewed women's differences as weaknesses. The second phase viewed their differences as a source of pride and confidence. And the shift in mindset was epitomized by the song we played when I first came up to the stage. I remember that song. I sang it as a young girl. I am strong. I am invincible. I am woman. Hear me roar in numbers too big to ignore. Women turned their attention at that time from naming themselves to naming the world. History was just arbitrary. It was all the rules and all the ideas that men had made. It was his story. And it was time for that to change. So women took it into her own hands to change that, from economics to politics, psychology, linguistics, relationships, religion. Women needed to change that which had been construed for male advantage. So women began to institute women's programs in colleges and universities. Prior to 1969, there were no women's studies courses. By the end of the 70s, the number of women's studies courses had mushroomed to over 30,000 across the United States. Educators modified grade school curriculum, continuing education courses, and courses at technical schools. This was the golden age of feminism. At the opening of the decade, there were very few women who would call themselves feminists. But by the end of that decade, feminism has dispersed, the ideology had dispersed to affect almost every member of society. Many women had claimed the feminist right to name self and to name the world, and soon, both in secular and religious circles, they started to claim another right that logically followed, and that was the right to name God. When Helen Reddy accepted the Grammy Award for I Am Woman song, she said, "I'd like to thank God because she made everything possible." Betty Friedan, earlier that same year, had predicted that the great debate of the next decade would be, is God he? Feminists had named themselves and their world, and in the final phase, they began to turn their attention to naming God. They concluded that if God is male, then the male is God, so of course God isn't he. Well then, who or what is God? According to feminism, women decide. And ultimately, that means that they themselves are God. Follows logically. The feminist metaphysic teaches that each woman contains divinity within her own being. New Age philosophy, Wicca, goddess worship are all expressions of this feminist spirituality. Have you ever wondered how and why advertisers named their new women's shaver after a goddess and market their product as being able to provide stubble-free legs worthy of the goddess in you? The fundamental premise of feminism is that women need and can trust no other authority than our own personal truth. And that was a really quick flyover of just where we've come from in the last 40, 50 years. It was a philosophical quake that shook underground. And like a tsunami, the waves of the implications of that have come back over society in wave after wave after wave. And the carnage is unbelievable. The carnage in young women's lives, in older women's lives, the carnage is unbelievable. We are so broken. We have been taught that we ought not to bow and submit to any external power. But that's not the message of the Bible. God created us. He created us male and female. And that's not inconsequential. That means something.